In September of 2012, 23-year-old Millie Kim went on a routine day hike in the Mount Hood National Forest. She disappeared a few hours after a couple of hikers saw her on a trail near an abandoned quarry. 3 months passed, and when a geology student named Alex Reynolds bent under a fallen spruce tree to take a soil sample, little did he know that within minutes he would open the door to an old root cellar and find a girl in a metal mask chained to the wall. It was the beginning of a case that would forever change the way the locals viewed the danger of the Mount Hood Mountains. On September 15, 2012, a Saturday, at approximately 9 o'clock in the morning, 23-year-old Millie Kim, a graduate student in the biology department of the University of Oregon, pulled into the parking lot at Trillium Lake. According to the visitor's log, she left her blue car and headed down a little-used trail that was marked on the map as number 657. It was a route that was hardly used by tourists. The trail stretched away from the popular circular route around the lake, disappeared into dense spruce thickets, and led to an old, long-abandoned quarry that was labeled unsafe to travel in Forest Service records. According to Millie's neighbor, she planned to spend only 1 day in the forest, collect moss samples for her dissertation, and return in the evening. The call arrangement was clear. Millie was to get in touch no later than 9 o'clock in the evening. However, the phone remained off. On Sunday morning, the neighbor called several more times and then filed a missing persons report with the Portland police. That same day, around 20 o'clock, rangers from the Mount Hood National Forest found her car in the same parking lot where the log entry was recorded. The car was locked and there were no signs of forced entry. Inside was a thermal mug, a spare sweater, and a printed map of the route with her notes. The absence of any signs of a hurried return meant that Millie had not returned to the car after hitting the trail. On Sunday evening, the Clackamas County Search and Rescue Department decided to bring in several canine teams. On Monday morning, volunteers from the local organization Mission Search and Rescue Oregon joined the operation. According to one of the coordinators, it was clear at that point that the disappearance was not an accidental delay or route violation. The first important clue came from the testimony of a couple of hikers who had met Millie on a narrow section of trail near the turnoff to the quarry on Saturday at approximately 11:30 in the morning. According to them, the girl looked calm, was carrying a small dark gray backpack, and when asked where she was going, she said she was collecting samples of rare mosses in shaded, damp crevices. According to the tourists, Millie did not look exhausted or anxious, moved with a confident stride, and did not mention any difficulties with navigation. Monday's search focused on the area of the abandoned quarry. According to the rangers' protocol, this area posed an increased risk due to old pits, landslides, and unrecorded mine holes. The dogs were unable to pick up a stable trail. According to the dog handlers, the scent was broken by gusts of wind and numerous crossings of the tracks of other tourists who passed by the lake over the weekend. On Monday evening, it was decided to expand the search area. The task force divided the area into several sectors within a radius of about 3 miles from the last likely point where Millie was seen alive. A helicopter was deployed to use thermal imaging in the dark, but the dense spruce cover made accurate ground scanning virtually impossible. On Tuesday morning, the operations leadership received a report from 2 volunteers who were inspecting the southern slope near the gorge. They reported finding traces of old shoes, but due to the rainy weather, the prints were blurred and it was not possible to identify them. The foresters noted that routes often disappear in this area, so an accidental deviation from the main trail is quite possible, but even then, a person usually leaves at least some traces of their stay. A piece of cloth, a broken branch, a depression from an attempt to go down the steep slope. In Millie's case, there were no such signs. On Tuesday afternoon, the volunteers carefully combed the trail junctions, as some of them are not marked on modern maps, but have been preserved from the time of old logging. According to one of the search participants, they passed at least a dozen unofficial passages created by hunters, but did not find any traces of Millie. All participants of the search operation noted the same detail. The forest in this area was extremely quiet. The absence of branch movement, animal sounds, and even the characteristic rustling of air over the clusters of dry needles created the feeling that someone had suddenly turned off the natural background. This was not recorded in the reports as evidence, but everyone who worked that day in the sector near the quarry recalled the oppressive silence that hung over the area. On the third day, the search shifted toward the western slope, where there were several abandoned hunting trails. It was there that the dog handlers tried to pick up the scent again, using Millie as clothes provided by her neighbors. However, the dogs gave scattered signals at different points, indicating not the direction of movement, but rather that the scent was being carried by the wind from different parts of the gorge. On Wednesday evening, preliminary results were summarized. Over the course of 3 days, the search teams combed the area of several dozen square miles, inspected the beds of seasonal streams, checked suspension bridges, old logging roads, crevices, ferns, and several abandoned shelters once used by hunters. The reservoirs were examined with a thermal imager and long poles, but no clues were found. The most official conclusion among the rangers at the time was as follows. Millie either voluntarily went off the trail in a direction that was not on the maps at all, or something happened so suddenly that she did not have time to call for help. Neither theory explained the absence of findings that even an accident usually leaves behind. A piece of cloth, a piece of equipment, crumpled plants, slip, or fall marks. The Mount Hood forest was an open space only at first glance. As soon as you stepped away from the main trail for just a few dozen steps, the ground began to sink under your feet, revealing hidden roots, old sinkholes, and shallow pits from ancient woodworking operations. In these places, it is easy to get lost, even for an experienced tourist, let alone a person immersed in field notes and collecting samples. But even this version seemed incomplete. Even if Millie had stumbled, her backpack, tools, or at least some of her belongings should have been found. At the end of the third day, the operations leadership decided to move the search to other areas, more distant from the original route. However, all participants realized that either Millie was in a place where no one was looking, or something had happened that did not fit the usual logic of disappearances in the Mount Hood Mountains. The forest was silent, and each new square of the search map only confirmed that it was in no hurry to give up its secrets. About 3 months have passed since the search for Millie Kim was first reported as a missing person. On December 19, 2012, a group of geology students from the University of Oregon were conducting routine fieldwork in one of the least visited areas of the Mount Hood National Forest. The place where they set out that morning was not listed in tourist guides and was not part of any popular trail. According to the teacher who led the expedition, it was a dead sector, an area where even experienced biologists rarely walked due to dense overgrowth, flood sinkholes, and deep root holes. The group moved slowly, recording the soil composition under the huge Douglas firs. It was under one of these, a fallen one with an exposed root system almost as tall as a man, that a student named Alex Reynolds lingered. He said he had moved away from the group for only a few dozen steps to take additional samples in an area where the ground was unusually soft, as if it were loosened from the inside. As Alex walked around the back of the tree, he noticed what he later called an alien geometry among the natural lines of the trunks and roots. Between the thick roots, wrapped in moss and ferns, he could see an almost crumbling structure of boards. They stood at an angle, as if they had once formed a door, but were now skewed and almost embedded in the soil. A part of an old hinge could be seen on the left, and in the center was a wooden stake, hammered in roughly and unevenly. According to service records, there were indeed farm plots in the area at one time, and some of them had root cellars that were dug right under the trees, using their root system as natural walls. Most of these shelters had been destroyed by floods and landslides, but a few could theoretically have survived. At first, Alex thought they were the remains of an old tool cache, but the smell alerted him. According to the student himself, when he opened the fern, he smelled air that shouldn't come out of the ground. Dampness mixed with the musty smell that is typical of closed rooms without ventilation. Curiosity outweighed caution. He took off his backpack, pulled out a small sapper pick used for working with soil, and tried to move the bent board. It took him several minutes to push the stake out and widen the gap enough to get inside. According to his testimony, at this point he did not realize the danger. He thought that a small cavity would open up in front of him, possibly filled with garbage or empty cans. As he crawled inside, the light of the flashlight he was holding cut through the darkness of the narrow underground room. The room was little larger than a small shed and almost entirely lined with old, darkened bricks. On the floor were damp hay bales, junk, and a few shards of pottery. It looked as if no one had been in here for decades. But in an instant, that impression was shattered. When Alex turned the flashlight beam to the right wall, he noticed a dark silhouette that at first seemed like a mannequin. It was only when he took a step closer that he could see the details. A man was chained to a thick beam embedded in the brick wall. The arm, twisted at an unnatural angle, was fixed with a metal brace so tight that the skin under the chain was a dark crimson color. According to Alex, the first thing he heard was a faint, barely perceptible sound, a moan so quiet it could have been the wind. The body on the wall swayed slightly, as if the person was teetering on the edge of consciousness. The most terrifying part was the mask. On the head of a woman, as was clear from her physique and the remains of her clothes, was a crudely assembled metal structure that completely covered her face and head. The metal had rust stains, and where there should have been slots for ventilation, narrow slits filled with earth and dust could be seen. The flashlight fell on the mask at an angle, and Alex saw scratches, many parallel lines made from the inside, as if a person had tried to pull it off with their fingernails. He would later tell the rescuers that it was these scratches and a soft, strangled moan that made him freeze. According to the student, the woman moved so slowly that the movement resembled the movement of a wounded animal that does not have the strength to escape. Inside the cellar, there was a smell of metal, moisture, and a human body that had been without light and fresh air for a long time. Nearby on the ground were empty plastic bottles, a gnawed wooden bowl, and a faded piece of blanket rolled into a damp lump. All of this indicated that someone had been coming to the site regularly and bringing minimal supplies of food and water. The student, according to his group, jumped out of the hole so quickly that he fell to his knees in the moss. He shouted for someone to call the rescue service immediately, but was unable to explain clearly what he saw, as his voice was shaky and his hands were shaking. The teacher and 2 other students approached the entrance to the cellar, but none of them went inside at that moment to avoid destroying possible traces. All they could see was darkness and breathable puffs of cold air coming out of the ground. According to the procedure, the group immediately transmitted the coordinates to the Forest Service dispatcher. According to the teacher, the response came in less than a minute, and 20 minutes later, the first rescuers were already making their way through the dense undergrowth. While they were waiting for help, the students stood near the entrance and tried not to look into the hole. One of the witnesses recalled that from time to time, a barely audible sound came from inside. Not like words, more like an attempt to breathe through metal. The rescuers who arrived first recorded their initial impressions on a dictaphone. One of them described what he saw as follows: "It's dark, damp, and there is movement in the depths. There are vital functions. Visibility is poor, but the object, a person, is sitting or chained to the wall." The further actions of the services and medics were described in separate protocols, but the fact remained obvious. Deep in the wild Oregon forest, under the roots of a century-old spruce, in an old, long-forgotten cellar, they found a living person who had obviously spent a considerable amount of time there in complete isolation. Everyone who participated in the rescue operation that day later recalled that this section of the forest had a strange, oppressive silence, as if the place itself did not want to reveal what it had been hiding for so many weeks. Evacuation from the forest began immediately after rescuers confirmed that the woman found in the underground cellar was alive. According to the first responders, she was in a state of deep exhaustion. Her body temperature was below normal, her breathing was shallow, and her skin was cold and pale. Her arms and shoulders showed signs of prolonged compression with metal, indicating that she had been held in the same position for days or even weeks. The chain on her wrist had to be cut off with a bolt cutter. Otherwise, it was impossible to lift the woman to the surface. A Forest Service helicopter equipped with an evacuation cradle hovered over the scene. When she was brought to the surface, the rescuers noted that the woman was too weak to respond to light or voices. The only thing they could identify at that point was a metal mask that remained tightly clamped around her head and covered her face so tightly that it was impossible to determine if she was conscious. The mask was not amenable to any of the tools that the rescuers had at their disposal. The helicopter took the victim to Sunrise Medical Center in Portland. This medical facility had protocols for receiving victims of prolonged detention and severe hypothermia. A team of surgeons and toxicologists was already waiting in the trauma department. The doctors immediately saw that the main threat was not only cold and exhaustion, but also infections that could develop due to numerous cuts on the arms, shoulders, and back. Some of the wounds showed signs of old ones, others were fresh, inflicted at different times. According to the medical protocol, the removal of the mask was classified as a surgical procedure. The massive metal object covered the head with a solid structure that had only narrow slits for breathing. The anesthesiologist later reported that the patient did not respond to the light of the flashlight and did not open her eyes. The mask had to be unclamped using special medical hydraulic tools, similar to those used to cut off accidentally deformed metal parts at accident scenes. When the mask was removed, the doctors identified the woman by her personal features, but the final confirmation was received only after checking her photographs and fingerprints. It was Millie Kim, a graduate student at the University of Oregon who went missing 3 months ago in the Trillium Lake area. At the time, she was in a state of deep disorientation, unable to speak and barely responding to external stimuli. While work was underway in the operating room, Clackamas County Police received the coordinates of the cellar from rescuers and sent forensic experts to the site. The area was inaccessible, and rescuers laid a temporary rope line to get to the fallen tree. According to one of the forensic experts, the entrance to the cellar was so well disguised as a natural relief that without an accidental shift in the soil, it could not have been noticed for many years. The team of experts worked inside the cellar for almost an hour. They recorded every inch of the room: damp walls, remnants of old beams, small traces of rust where the chain was fixed. They found several empty water bottles and a chewed-up wooden bowl on the floor. This meant that someone regularly brought in minimal food supplies. According to one of the experts, the nature of the stains indicated that water was brought in frequently. The period between refills was long. Several items were also found that were immediately sent for examination: scraps of synthetic fabric of unknown origin, a piece of plastic packaging without any markings, and one broken metal shackle that could indicate escape attempts. Forensic experts did not find any documents, electronic devices, or traces of the kidnapper's long stay. Most likely, the kidnapper came for short periods and left a minimum of traces. Special attention was paid to the mechanism of the mask. Forensic experts described it as an amateurish but functionally sound design. The metal was heterogeneous, partly welded, partly bolted together. The inner surface had traces of fabric that might have once served as a lining, but had completely decomposed from moisture. The mask was sent to the laboratory as it could contain microscopic traces of the kidnapper's skin or hair. While the initial procedural steps were underway, the doctors informed the police that Millie's condition had stabilized. After removing the mask and clearing her airways, they managed to connect her to oxygen support. According to the chief resuscitator, the greatest threat was general hypothermia and exhaustion, which could have been fatal if the evacuation had been delayed for at least a few hours. About an hour after the identification, the police contacted Millie's parents, who had almost given up hope. They were told that their daughter had been found alive, but in an extremely serious condition. The conversation was recorded in the service log as emotional, short, with confirmation of the victim's identity. Meanwhile, the hospital was preparing the patient for a series of examinations. A forensic expert working with the doctors noted that her hands and feet showed signs of prolonged binding, and her head had uniform abrasions, corresponding to contour masks. This meant that she wore it for most of the time spent in the cellar. The same evening, the county's forensic department issued its first preliminary conclusion. The woman was held in a room that was not designed for a long stay. The cellar had no ventilation, no natural light, and was built a long time ago, presumably as an old farmhouse. The use of this place as a shelter for holding a person required regular returns of the kidnapper, as evidenced by fresh water stains and food remains. At that point, the police already had every reason to believe that Millie was the victim of an organized criminal who knew the area and knew how to avoid noticeable traces. The next step was to begin interrogating local residents, checking old land registers, analyzing abandoned farm plots, and searching for possible witnesses who might have seen suspicious figures in that part of the forest in the past months. But at that moment, the most important thing was different: to confirm that the woman found was Millie Kim, and to ensure that she had a chance to survive the unknown captivity that almost cost her life. The investigation was officially transferred to the Clackamas County Major Crimes Unit the morning after Millie Kim's rescue. Detective Anthony Lambert, one of the few investigators who specialized in crimes in remote areas, was appointed as the lead. His experience working in the forest districts of Oregon proved crucial. He had a good understanding of how criminals use natural hiding places and knew what small signs might indicate their presence. When the forensic team returned to the cellar in daylight, it became apparent to them that the holding place was not a random hole in the ground. Someone had systematically used it and carefully concealed it from prying eyes. The fallen spruce covering the entrance was not a natural fall. Its roots showed signs of a cut, and there was compacted earth under the roots, indicating that the tree had been deliberately moved from its original position to hide the door. Within a few yards, the experts began to collect traces. They first came across a deep shoe print in the damp ground. The researchers described it as a large male footprint with a distinctive feature. The tread on the left sole had a crack that formed a crescent shape. Such a deformation is rare. It usually occurs after hitting a sharp stone or metal part. The trace was repeated in 2 other places, one at the cellar entrance and the other in the area between the roots of an old spruce tree. This indicated that the kidnapper had repeatedly followed the same trajectory. According to one of the experts, this repetition of the footprints meant that the perpetrator had a familiar route, not the chaotic movements typical of strangers or animals. It was his path, and he walked it many times. The second discovery was pieces of synthetic rope. They were lying on the ground in the immediate vicinity of the entrance. The structure of the fibers was similar to those used by climbers for short belaying segments. The ends were torn, not cut, indicating a strong mechanical stress. According to investigators, the rope could have been used to transport heavy objects to the cellar or as an additional lock for the door. But the most disturbing thing was a small piece of plastic found under the tree, almost pressed into the soil. We could barely lift it with tweezers without damaging it. On the piece, which was almost the size of a coin, a fragment of an inscription could be read, the last 2 letters of rear. Forensic experts suggested that it could have been part of a tag from a backpack or bag that once bore the full brand name. After enlarging the photo, it became clear that the font matched the products manufactured by a hiking equipment manufacturer known by a name that contained the word outdoors in combination with prior. The products of this brand were actively sold online and distributed throughout the United States, making it difficult to identify the buyer. The cellar itself turned out to be much older than originally thought. During the analysis of the wooden beams, experts found that they had been processed in a way typical of farms at the beginning of the last century. This meant that the cellar had existed in the forest long before someone decided to convert it into a detention center. There were no traces of modern tools or paint on the beams, but there were new screws, shiny, with no signs of corrosion. They held the metal bracket to which the chain holding Millie was chained. This showed that the criminal had access to modern materials, but did not intentionally use new equipment outside of critical areas. The chain, according to forensic experts, was an old industrial product without serial numbers or markings. Such chains are often found in agricultural warehouses, workshops, or farms where heavy machinery is stored. This opened up a whole new avenue of investigation. It was necessary to check all abandoned farms in the area and find those where old stocks of metal tools might have been left. The investigators also noticed the soil at the entrance. The ground was compacted, as if someone had often stood in the same place. Unlike the shoe prints, this area had no clear shapes, but was too dense to be natural. One of the forensic scientists suggested that the abductor could have been sitting or standing there for a long time, perhaps listening to see if anyone was nearby or waiting for Millie to stop making sounds. A few other pieces of circumstantial evidence were found around the area. A piece of metal ring that looked like part of a fastener. Small traces of soot on the cellar ceiling indicating that a lantern or candle had been lit inside at least once, and a few hairs that could have belonged to the victim or the perpetrator. The last detail that made the biggest impression on Lambert was the distance between the footprints found. They did not lead deep into the forest as investigators had expected, but instead formed a small circle around the cellar. This meant that the kidnapper had come to this particular place and returned the way he came without wandering around the neighborhood. Such confidence indicated a person who knew the area as well as a professional hunter, or a person who had worked in the forest for years. She moved confidently, left no unnecessary traces, and used a route that was not on the radar of tourists or rangers. The investigation was just beginning, but the first findings made one thing clear. The kidnapper was not a random passerby. He acted deliberately, knew the area, chose moments when there were no outsiders in the forest, and used equipment that rarely leaves simple traces. It was the handwriting of a person who had been working in the shadows of the forest for a long time and knew how to make sure that he was not noticed. The first testimony of Millie Kim was not received immediately. The doctors allowed detectives to ask questions only in short blocks with long pauses so as not to overload her. The doctors noted that the patient reacted slowly to the voices, as if she was waking up after a multi-day fever. Her speech was quiet, intermittent, but consistent, as much as her condition allowed. The detectives wrote down every word. According to Millie, she remembered the last moment before her disappearance clearly. It was a day when she was collecting mosses near an abandoned quarry. She was working near a large scree wall when she heard footsteps behind her. According to the victim, a male voice greeted her and identified himself as a Forest Service worker. He had a badge, but Millie didn't have time to look at it. The sun was in her eyes, and the man was standing on the edge of light and shadow. The stranger's behavior, she said, seemed normal at first. He asked why she was working near the quarry, what kinds of mosses she was studying, and whether she knew about the dangerous parts of the trail. According to Millie, his voice was calm and unemotional, but she did not feel threatened. Then, as she put it, it all came to an abrupt end. She didn't see the object that hit her, but she felt a strong blow to the back of her head and lost consciousness. The next thing she could remember was deep darkness, piercing cold moisture, and the feeling that she could not move her right arm. When she fully regained consciousness, she found herself sitting in a narrow room, pinned to the wall by a metal chain. The metal mask, which was later removed by doctors, was on her from the very beginning. According to Millie, the mask was pressed tightly to her head, and she could only hear her own breathing and the muffled sounds of harsh metal with every movement. The mask covered her face so much that she could not determine where in the room the source of sound, light or movement was. All she knew was that it was always dark in the cellar, even when the door was slightly open. For the first hours after waking up, she tried to figure out if she was alone. There was silence around her, broken only by the barely audible sound of the wind from above. Later, she recalled hearing the roots of the tree that covered the cellar crackling. This was the only external sound that gave her a clue. Something alive existed above ground, but not below. The appearance of the kidnapper was the same every time. According to Millie, he never spoke. She could only hear his footsteps, heavy, steady, short. At first, there was one sound, a wooden board sliding or being pushed aside, then a few steps deeper, then a soft metal clang. Perhaps he was putting something on the ground. According to the victim, he brought bottles of water and sometimes some food. She could not see what he left behind, but it tasted like either dry nutritional bars or bread that easily broke apart when touched. The most disturbing element was the silence. According to Millie, he never said a word once. She tried several times to speak to him, asking him to take off the mask, asking him to know where she was. But the man did not respond. He just did his job and then disappeared as quietly as he came. She didn't know how many days had passed. The mask did not allow her to estimate the change of light, and there was no source in the cellar to count the time. The only marks she tried to make were small scratches on the inside of the mask. She said she scratched the metal with her fingernails to keep a vestige of control over time, but then lost track. According to Millie, there was almost no space in the cellar. If she stretched her legs out, she rested them against the opposite wall. When she tried to lie down on her side, the metal of the mask would hit the bricks and make a cold sound. She said that sometimes this sound seemed to her like a voice, sometimes like a human breath, sometimes like a fierce whisper. But these were just echoes. The woman repeatedly emphasized that the abductor never came at the same time. Sometimes he appeared very early, sometimes when she was already barely holding on from exhaustion. She had no sense of rhythm, only periodic, sporadic appearances. This, according to the psychologists who worked with her, could be one of the strategies for complete control over the prisoner. Millie also recalled the moment when she heard a sound similar to tools or wood being cut. It was the first time she realized that there was movement above the cellar. She tried to scream as much as her mask allowed, but the sound was lost inside the metal. She stated that it was the first moment of hope. Her own words about her abductor, which she uttered almost in a whisper. "He always knew when to come back, but I don't know where he came from or where he disappeared to. You can't hear him until he's close by." According to the report, the detectives noted, Millie described a man of about average to slightly above average height, with heavy footsteps that she could feel through the floor. His hands were covered with a glove or cloth when he was reaching for water or food. She could not see skin. She could not name a single feature, a single detail of his face, because she had never seen his face. He was also wearing a mask. She could tell by the sound of his breathing and a slight metallic rustling at her face level as he leaned closer. What she remembered most was not his appearance, but his demeanor, silence, lack of haste, predictable movements, and the absence of any emotional response. All of her testimony was documented accurately, without assumptions. And although these details provided only fragments of the overall picture, the detectives for the first time received a description of the person who had been holding Millie underground for weeks or longer, in a place that no one had associated with human presence for a long time. Her story became the basis for the first specialized conclusions, and at the same time opened a new layer of questions about who could have known about the existence of such a cellar for years and used it without attracting the attention of either rangers or local residents. After Millie Kim's initial testimony and analysis of the evidence found in the forest, experts from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, including a team specializing in behavioral analysis of criminals, officially joined the investigation. They were invited because of the atypical nature of the case, a carefully disguised place of detention, a complete lack of direct contact between the perpetrator and the victim, the use of a homemade mask, and the kidnapper's apparent ability to avoid detection for a long time. Behavioral analysts insisted that a separate profile should be created for such crimes, not to be mixed with typical cases of kidnapping for profit. Given the details Millie provided and the nature of the footprints in the cellar, they determined that this was a so-called organized type of criminal. This meant that he acted deliberately, consistently, and had a stable way of controlling the victim without relying on improvisation. The main feature of the profile was the choice of location. The old farm cellar, converted into an underground cell, gave the offender a number of advantages. It was so well hidden that even experienced foresters could pass by it without suspecting the existence of a room under the roots of a tree. According to analysts, the hijacker knew this area of the forest not just well, but he knew it in his own way. It was a space he used, felt, and moved around in as if it were his own backyard. This meant that the person either lived nearby for a long time or worked systematically in the forest. The most likely version was a specialist associated with logging, poaching, working in isolated conditions, or those who were used to avoiding official routes and inspections. The very fact that the kidnapper was able to move without leaving any traces indicated experience, no less than that of a professional hunter or guide. The style of contact with the victim provided even more information. Millie emphasized the perpetrator's complete silence. He did not say a word, even when she tried to talk to him. According to behavioral experts, this was a deliberate strategy. Silence allowed the perpetrator to remain completely anonymous, deprived the victim of the opportunity to establish at least minimal emotional contact, and at the same time created an atmosphere of complete control. The mask he wore during each visit to the cellar confirmed this. Not only did it hide his face, it turned him into a faceless figure that could not be identified. According to FBI analysts, the use of this type of mask is typical of criminals who seek not only to hide their identity, but also to detach the victim from reality, creating the impression that they are not facing a person, but a mechanical presence. This allows them to significantly reduce the victim's ability to resist psychologically. Experts also emphasize the importance of the fact that the perpetrator came without a schedule. There was no set time of day or night when he appeared. This meant two things. First, he had flexible access to the area and was not tied to work or family in the usual sense. Second, he wanted the victim to lose the sense of time. And this is not just a method of control, it is a method of destruction. The analysts noted that during her captivity, Millie heard very few sounds from the outside, only the wind and the occasional crackling of wood. This meant there were no neighboring objects or human activity at close range. The location was not chosen by chance. It was in a dead zone with no tourist routes, marked roads, or even unofficial trails. This choice was indicative of a systematic approach. The criminal could have been exploring the forest for years, choosing a point that offered no risk of being heard. FBI experts also noted details that pointed to his psychological structure. The absence of dialogues, the absence of violence for pleasure, the absence of chaos in his actions. All of this made him closer to the type of cold controller. Unlike impulsive criminals, such a person acts not out of affect, but out of the conviction that he has the right to do what he does. The behavioral profile described him as a middle-aged or slightly older man, physically fit, with rough work skills and knowledge of tools. He could have been a laborer who had been repeatedly hired for seasonal logging work, or a poacher who used the forest as his own territory. It was also possible that he lived within a few miles of the site, using old trailers, temporary shelters, or illegal camps. Another important characteristic of the perpetrator was his ability to disappear. Forensic experts did not find any traces of a vehicle near the cellar. This meant that he either came on foot or left the vehicle very far away. In any case, he was ready to cover long distances over difficult terrain, which again testified to his physical fitness. A separate paragraph of the profile was devoted to motives. The analysts pointed out that his actions did not resemble sexual crimes, mercenary motives, or a desire to inflict quick harm. The way he maintained the victim's condition, constant darkness, minimal food, no contact, was more like an experiment or a way of complete domination. He was not interested in the victim's death, but in the long process of controlling him. All these findings gave the detectives an understanding of who they were dealing with. A man who was quiet, invisible, but extremely dangerous. A man who knew the forest like others know their own home. A man who had prepared for the kidnapping in advance and left no unnecessary clues. A man who had already demonstrated an exceptional ability to remain invisible. The profile was not just a paper document. It was a map of a hunter who had never been seen in person, but whose trail was now being confidently deciphered through every small detail of the cellar and the victim's testimony. The official teams had already reported their interim findings when Detective Lambert decided to return to what was usually overlooked. He spent several days at the Clackamas County Archives, reviewing reports of disappearances in Oregon's forests over the past decade. Most of the stories were commonplace for these places. People getting off trails, falling into canyons, breaking their legs, freezing in the winter. But among all the cases, there were several episodes in which lone hikers disappeared for no logical reason. In 2 cases, dating from different years, witnesses recalled a man who would appear unexpectedly on the trails and always talk about rare plants, saying that he was collecting data for his own herbarium. The description was vague and general, but the police considered such coincidences dangerous. All these episodes remained unsolved. There were no bodies, no items, no routes that could be reconstructed. Just a small fraction of the records in police databases, evidence that time had erased, and speculation that led nowhere. When Lambert's team began working with the items recovered from the root cellar, the first thing that caught their eye was a fragment of a tag, a plastic strip with illegible letters E. Ryor. At the technical meeting, the forensic experts immediately recognized the find as extremely unpromising. Chinese factories had been supplying similar tags for dozens of brands for years, mostly cheap backpacks sold online and without clear records. The detective team decided to check all the gear stores within the state, but it turned out to be just a formality. Not a single seller could tell them who exactly they had sold the model they were looking for. The supply chain was too extensive. The shoe prints also proved to be a dead end. The prints showed signs of mid-priced work boots bought by forestry workers, farmers, and construction workers. The tread with a crescent-shaped crack could be an individual feature, but it did not provide any real clues. Thousands of Oregonians bought such boots every year. The inner surface of the prints showed no impurities other than standard forest soil, a mixture of sand, clay, and humus found everywhere in the Mount Hood area. The rope fragments gave more hope only at first glance. The synthetic material used by climbers, the strength of the fiber, and the distinctive way it was woven made the rope common, available in every gear store along the coast. Even experts from the technical forensics department confirmed that it was almost impossible to identify the owner from such remains. Gradually, the investigation shifted to interviewing locals. Lambert talked to residents of remote houses, hunters, loggers, and anyone who might have noticed movement deep in the forest. That's how he first heard several references to a hermit, a man who sometimes appeared on the trails but would not allow anyone to approach. His description, according to those who saw the vague figure among the branches, did not match anyone in particular. Some said he was older, others said he was middle-aged. Some saw a thin figure, others a broad one. But everyone had one thing in common. He came quietly and disappeared just as quietly, as if he were disappearing between the trees. The only testimony that was specific to the root cellar came from a hiker who happened to be in the area a few weeks before Millie was found. He saw a figure in a dark hood, but, as he put it, I couldn't even describe the color of his face. The witness was terrified and stopped driving in that area, but could not add anything concrete. The figure stood still, without signs of aggression, and then disappeared between the trunks so quickly that it seemed almost unreal. It all added up to an extremely unpleasant picture. It was as if someone had been living in the forest for years, well versed in its terrain, knew every ravine, every old path, every hiding place. And at the same time, he left behind nothing that could help determine his route or method of transportation. Lambert studied the map of the area a second and third time, facing the same paradox. The terrain was so complex and the forest so dense that a person with the right experience could be invisible to anyone. Even the rangers who patrolled Mount Hood year after year. The cellar under the roots of the old spruce, hidden among the eternal darkness and mosses, also indicated a long knowledge of the area. One had to know that the tree was stable, that the soil beneath it would not cave in, that the smell of decay would be hidden among the natural scents of the forest. All the data collected only confirmed that their perpetrator was a quiet, careful, cautious person. A person who did not use expensive equipment, did not leave brand markers, did not buy anything that could be traced. A person who thought practically and acted methodically. Time passed, but no new clues appeared. The forest was as cold and indifferent as ever. The paths that the rescuers walked on were overgrown in weeks. The places where they were looking for fresh tracks were washed away by the rains. And if the criminal was indeed that unknown hermit, he had an undeniable advantage. The forest was his home, and the fog was his blanket. It seemed that the person holding Millie knew every minute when he could disappear unnoticed. The investigation was again narrowed down to a few dozen pages in the file, which repeated the same facts as before. In the evening, when Lambert was looking at the map again, he realized something he didn't want to admit out loud. The criminal had been one step ahead of them since Millie's disappearance. He had acted as if he knew that no one would be able to establish his route. That's how the case ended up in what the detectives called blind silence. Every piece of evidence crumbled under their fingers, every hypothesis bent under their own weight. The only thing that was certain was that someone in this forest knew how to disappear like no one else. Someone who had remained invisible for years. Someone who seemed to disappear into the pines and mists of Mount Hood. After Millie Kim's rescue, it took several weeks before doctors allowed her to return to a more or less normal life. The doctors recorded a slow but steady positive trend. Her heart activity normalized and her nervous reactions gradually recovered. However, psychologists emphasized that the consequences of prolonged confinement in the dark would be long-lasting. She could not stay in closed rooms without light for a long time. She had sharp reactions to the sound of metal on a hard surface and to any dull footsteps from behind. According to her supervisor, Millie insisted on returning to school earlier than the specialists recommended. She spent a few weeks at home with her parents before returning to the university lab. However, the subject of her research had changed radically. Instead of specializing in moss microflora, she switched her attention to the behavioral patterns of tourists in wilderness and risk factors in the sparsely populated routes of the national forests. According to the students to whom she gave her first lectures after her recovery, her presentations were dry, precise, and more like lifeguarding reports than university seminars. She showed photos of marked dangerous areas, quoted statistics, and talked about the critical state of mobile communications in certain sectors of Mount Hood. All this was presented without emotion, almost mechanically. At the same time, the investigation was moving slowly, but Detective Lambert continued to work on the case even as other departments began to lose activity. In his office on the first floor of the police department, there was a large folder labeled Kim, Millie, Hold Doc Unidentified Perpetrator. This folder contained copies of CELLAR photos, interrogation reports, transcriptions of forensic notes, maps of the area, and printouts of satellite images. According to his colleagues, Lambert reviewed all the materials every time there was even a tiny bit of new information about the movement of people in remote areas of Mount Hood. Several times a month, the police received reports of strange movements in the forest. These were testimonies from hunters who saw a light from a lantern in the distance in places where there were no trails, or tourists who heard a sound like metal friction at night near old clearings. All these cases were recorded, but it was almost never possible to check them promptly. Most of these areas covered dozens of acres of impenetrable thickets where one could get lost even during the day. The phantom image of an unknown criminal became part of local conversations. A few months after Millie's rescue, her story appeared in regional publications and later on national news portals. Reporters called her the girl in the iron mask, quoting doctors about the complexity of the surgery to remove the metal structure and the nature of her injuries. The publicity of the story led to a number of changes. The National Forestry Administration installed additional information boards on popular hiking trails, emphasizing the need to record departure and return times, register routes, and use GPS trackers. Forest rangers began conducting random inspections of sparsely traveled trails and received additional instructions on how to respond to reports of unknown persons in non-tourist areas. However, all of these changes were primarily related to tourist areas. The situation has hardly changed in the depths of the forest, old farm plots and abandoned farms. These places remained isolated. There were no cameras, mobile communication was cut off after a few hundred yards, and traveling without GPS required experience that not everyone had. Rumors began to spread among local hunters that someone lives in the forest. Some talked about the light of a lantern that flickered behind the gorge on a moonless night. Others spoke of quiet, almost imperceptible footsteps behind them, after which no trace could be found. Some spoke of scratches in the trees, as if someone had left marks on purpose, but they disappeared after the rain as quickly as they appeared. In most cases, these accounts were vague and contradictory. Lambert repeatedly traveled to the reported sites, but never found anything concrete. Only a feeling that was difficult to describe in a report. Staff members spoke of an intrusive silence, thicker than usual, and a sense of presence that disappeared as soon as someone tried to record it. Despite the lack of progress, the case of Millie Kim remained officially open, with its status labeled as active, but without new key evidence. This allowed detectives to continue their work, but did not provide real opportunities for a potential arrest. None of the traces found pointed to a specific person. The forest did not retain prints, and the traces of the offender's route could have been erased weeks before the police showed up. The root cellar itself, thoroughly examined by forensic scientists, did not contain any DNA material that would have belonged to an outsider. This amazed even experienced experts. A person who regularly visited such a place should have left at least one hair, a piece of skin, a fingerprint. But she was not there, as if she had come in gloves, a mask, protective clothing, and knew exactly where not to touch the surfaces. Millie continued to recover, but even months after her rescue, she avoided the forests. According to people at her university, she avoided even parkland and could not stand the smell of moisture from old trees. She did not mention her abductor unless necessary, but in conversations with experts, she repeated one detail: his footsteps. She said she could never predict when he would appear, and that was the most terrifying thing for her. Detective Lambert kept one thing on his desk that symbolized the essence of the case for him. It was a photograph of the cellar taken by the forensic team on the day it was discovered. The picture showed only the root of an old spruce tree, a dark dip in the entrance, and the ground that looked almost inky in the shadows. This photo reminded him that the forest held the answers, but did not give them away. In fact, the investigation stopped, but the case was not closed. It remained in the databases, a silent reminder of a man who was still at large and knew these woods like no one else. Strange sounds continued to be heard deep in Mount Hood. The distant dull click of metal, footsteps that could not be traced, flickering lights that disappeared as soon as someone tried to approach. None of these testimonies were confirmed, but they all created the feeling that there was someone in the forest, someone who knew how to remain invisible. The case of Millie Kim remained without a final point, and no matter how hard the detectives worked, the truth remained where it always had, in the impenetrable thicket of the Oregon forests, which were big enough to hide any person if they knew how to disappear.